Okay, welcome to the Chris Hall NDIS podcast. My name is Chris Hall, your host, and today I've got Daniel Kyriacou with me from Achieve Australia. Daniel and I have known each other in the industry for a while. He is the Chief Operations Officer at Achieve Australia. Now, Achieve Australia is one of the largest providers in New South Wales, specialising in SIL and complex physical health. And they've been around for many, many decades, indeed one of the oldest providers in Australia. And so there's a lot of legacy, there's a lot of great philosophy, and there's also scale and really meaningful things that Achieve Australia does. So today we're going to talk about strategy, and we're going to focus on SIL and what's going on in the sector in particular currently in Australia. So Daniel, without further ado, welcome to the podcast and really good to see you.
It's great to talk to you, Chris. In fact, since last time we spoke, we've expanded to Queensland. So now we are in New South Wales and Queensland. Yeah.
Forgive me for not knowing that. Good on you. Congratulations.
Yeah. So we run SIL and drop-in support services in Queensland now.
That's brilliant news. That's fantastic. Well, listen, Daniel, your fingers so on the pulse in terms of the operational and I suppose strategic model of what SIL actually means. I know that Achieve Australia is often having clients that may also have SDA in their funding, but again, let's just kind of focus on the SIL aspect of things. You recently have been writing quite a few very thought-provoking articles on LinkedIn. So I guess I'd like to bring those into the conversation. One of them was about the vanishing sweet spot for providers. So what do you mean by the vanishing sweet spot, and why is it getting harder for providers to balance quality, sustainability, and growth within the NDIS?
I think that the way the scheme has evolved has meant that providers are kind of faced with a challenge of needing to have some scale to be able to be effective under the price model. There is always a drive and I think a passion to deliver the best quality of services possible, but often the challenge around quality comes when funding doesn't match an individual's needs. And providers are forced time and time again to make decisions about whether they continue to deliver a service that isn't funded because someone desperately needs it, who they've supported for a long time. And so that question around quality is also a question around often when do you withdraw supports that's not funded, even if and when someone needs them. And then on top of all of that, there is a real challenge, I think, under the current pricing model to drive its sustainability. And I think to be successful, you've got to try and find that really small landing pad where you're delivering high quality, you're growing to find scale, and at the same time, you're continually nickel and diming your way to try and find sustainability measures, which is a really large challenge. It's a challenge for organizations. And when I look across the sector, I see different providers that prioritize different areas of that at different times. So you see some providers who are putting all their focus on quality, but are making really large losses. You see other providers that are growing, trying to have scale, but you worry about some of the quality aspects. You worry about some of the underlying sustainability measures when you're trying to do that many mergers at once. And then you see some providers that are focused so much on cost control and cost cutting that they might not be dedicating the resources to other things. That's a really difficult space to be in as a strategic leader. And really, the sector or the market should be designed where really good providers who are delivering quality and efficiency can succeed. And I think at the moment, I see really good providers that aren't succeeding, and that worries me.
It does, me too. I mean, at Steadway, because since we saw each other in person, I've then gone away from consulting and started doing some of the things that I've been teaching about and learning about myself. And within my own business, we put in a 5-pillar framework to make sure that we are sustainable and profitable and also growing and scalable. And some of those aspects probably are worth talking about. So, for example, number one, we have an A players only for the office team approach. Like we don't want to have colleagues that we have to baby and hold the hand of all the time. We want to set them up for success and have people that can walk together. That's one. We do actually do elements of offshore where appropriate, and that where appropriate thing is a very key thing. Like I've done podcasts on that with some specialists in the sector, and it's not appropriate in certain risk assess roles where you're interacting with the client, but administrational, repetitive things offshore can present a unique opportunity for margin management. And then there's of course I won't mention all of them, but there's also then AI as a force multiplier. So like, it has to be done in a very, very ethical way, and an IT sound way, where the information is completely private, it's secure, we're dealing with very sensitive information. But there's classic things like, oh my god, I haven't got time to read all the shift notes. Well, actually, with large language models and things like that, you can absolutely put in systems and procedures to process the large volume of data that we have, and all those challenges there. Those are just three. But like, what do you think about some of those types of factors in terms of quality of people, the offshore, the AI factor? Where do you see those coming into the mix?
Look, I think there is real opportunity for innovation in lots of spaces. I know at Achieve, our philosophy is about going really deep. So being the experts in the kind of services that we deliver. So being our focus is on people who have complex support needs, often have to interact with multiple systems, including the disability system, have the need for complex behaviour support or intensive clinical support or other challenges. And our philosophy has been that what we provide is deep knowledge, deep experience, and systems and processes that are designed around managing people with complex support needs, where we know we can support them to thrive, and that they can live their best life engaging with our services, but also that we are able to manage all of the complexities that come with that. But in doing that, it's also about knowing that then there are some supports that probably our service is not designed to meet, because they might not need as intensive a level of systems and processes that sit in the background. So for us, it's about having a deep understanding of who we want to support and the systems and processes that we think deliver best outcomes for them. And where technology can support that, I think it is fantastic. And whether that's in some administrative systems, whether it's with working through information or providing data for decision making, I think all of that's really exciting. But the starting point for us is we want to be a provider with deep knowledge around the clients that we support.
I love that. I mean, what you're hitting on there is, of course, your niche. It's a deep niche that you've carved out over many decades. And back in my IT consulting days, I always was, repeating the wisdom of, it shouldn't be the IT system dictating the strategy of the business. It should be the business dictating the IT system, right? So what you're alluding to there quite correctly is that your deep expertise in complex care. That is the distinction. Everything else comes from that. So yes, your niche. You're describing your niche there and how you stand out.
Yeah, how I guess it's a bit how we differentiate ourselves in the market, but also, what we want is systems, processes, and people who are aligned to that kind of commitment to our kind of model for practice, our purpose. So for us, we want the people we support to have a sense of belonging. So belonging in the place that they live, in the communities they live in, and real inclusion. And we want to make sure our teams are all really driving towards that. Our systems and processes, the way that we organize ourselves, all are aligned to achieving that outcome.
Yeah, absolutely. And even on the scaling side of things, like, I know from a former business coaching that you really kind of have to punch beyond the 2 to 5 mil revenue range if you're for profit as a business. You got to punch through that to get to those real scale advantages. Even honestly, I can speak as a business owner, even that first pathway to the first 2 million, my gosh, you just kind of need that to be able to pay for an office and some basic managers, and maybe if you're lucky as an entrepreneur, pay yourself a salary. Like you got to push beyond, like, really. And that's the thing. There's a lot of people in the NDIS as startups that they're well intentioned, but they haven't run a business before. And so you can I think there's a lot of smaller providers that sometimes push through that ceiling and they go to flourish. But sometimes because of various factors, it remain a challenge. So I think there's the problem, isn't there, at the smaller provider end? That's why they're struggling, plus other factors as well. Because I think the scale thing is very relevant.
Yeah, I mean, people often talk about the explosion of numbers of people in the NDIS. And I always kind of think actually the biggest explosion has been the number of providers.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
We almost have as many providers as we have participants in some
Right.
parts of the market, and so I think that does create real challenge. And the underlying question for me is, and this is a challenge in not just disability. I think you've had similar challenges in aged care, certainly in childcare. How do you make sure there is safeguarding quality, outcomes-driven service delivery in a market that is exploding and where everyone is under financial pressure? I think it's a real market design challenge.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So let's kind of go into the SIL and the shared support arena here for a second and deep dive. You also had another article called Game of Fractions, which is a great title. And again, it's describing the current funding model and how what it can produce is an absurd outcome, such as, people being funded for the wrong things, whether it be awake or asleep on the same shift. And there's all these random scenarios that can emerge because of the funding model. What are some of the structural contradictions that are playing out into the day-to-day sort of SIL operations model?
So when the NDIS launched, the NDIA had a process where shared services, particularly accommodation style shared services, were planned out with the group together. In that, if there were going to be 3 people in the house, and they needed 1 staff member, then they all got 1 to 3 funding. And so from a provider's point of view, you were always being funded for 1 person to support a group of people. And there was consideration taken into what's happening. Now, given at any point there'll be flexibility through the year and that won't work out perfectly, but the concept, which is that you think about the shared services and how they'll be shared when they're funded and designed, I think led to better outcomes for the people being supported. It led to more sustainable outcomes for providers, but actually it also led to better outcomes for the agency. What they moved to at some point was to individualized shared funding. And what that can mean is in any group, they will all have their funding ratio, so 1 to 3 funding or 1 to 2 funding or 1 to 4 funding, based around their individual support needs. And then in the shared group that they live in, you've got to add those all together and see if it equals 1. And what we find more often than not is that sometimes you might be funded for 0.8 of a staff member to support a group of participants for an hour. And as we all know, I can't roster 0.8 of a human being. I can only roster 1. And so in that scenario, we're underfunded. And that's where some of the real margin challenges. At other times, we might be funded for 1.2 staff for that same hour. In that scenario, we're still just going to roster 1 person. So when I look at the model and how it comes together, I think you end up with real challenges to make the best outcome for everybody. So the NDIA and the taxpayer, they want efficient service delivery. They should absolutely get efficient service delivery. People with disability want flexibility and they want choice. And providers want to be able to deliver high quality supports sustainably. I think there is a way to do that. But when it's shared services, overnight being a great example, right? It makes sense to think about the group that is sharing those services and design their funding to be appropriate. So if you've got a group home where, or it might be an apartment, we've got plenty of these, where 1 person needs an active overnight support. So that means that during the night, because of their support needs, they need someone awake to assist them. So they might need clinical supports, they might need on-call medication, there might be other behavioural challenges that occur. The person in the bedroom next to them doesn't require that. The NDIA will fund 1 person to have a sleep staff member and the other person half the funding to have an awake staff member. And as we all know, I can't have a staff member asleep and awake at the same time. They can only be awake. And the award says once they're awake, I have to pay them the awake award rate. I think we just have to have a level of honesty and acknowledge that those are the systems we work in and the funding should be aligned to those. It's the risk is when you don't do that, you put providers in difficult situations and families and participants where they're trying to cut funding in other places to meet everybody's core needs.
Yes.
And my worry in that scenario is that then, in the hierarchy of decisions that get made between participants and providers, it's the kind of what's urgently needed or critically important that always has to come first. And so some of those other really important things, but that might be critical things that have to happen, get sacrificed to make all that model come together. It'd be better to have those discussions as a group and align the funding like we used to and like the NDIS review has recommended. I think that would be a better step forward.
Correct, because I mean the SIL model, generally speaking, if you even go out, let's jump out of STA style scenarios and just say, when people think SIL house, right? It's often either a house that if the provider's lucky they own, but they probably rent it and sublet to the client. There's so many levels of risk, aren't there? There's the tenancy risk. There's what you're taking a contribution from the disability support pension, maybe Commonwealth rental assistance, all that kind of stuff. But fundamentally, there's kind of the landlord risk of having tenants, and that's very real because it's a loss leader typically for the average SIL provider, just from a pure property management perspective. That's one thing. But then it gets kind of worse in the sense of if you set up that new house that's got 4 bedrooms, one for the sleepover and 3 for your 1 to 3 clients, you got the loss leader for the first client that you get in at 1 to 3. It's a loss leader. You literally you're bleeding money away, right? So that's a real problem. Maybe just about breaking even at 2 to 3, but that sometimes can be a bit naive. It depends on what your other sunken costs are as your business. So, like, it's we're all familiar with the idea of the vacancy risk, right? But do you have any thoughts on, because I suppose all of those barriers to entry, what it means to me is that if you're a growing provider, I'm sure even at scale, the unit maths have to make sense, and it's a bit of a gamble. It's a gamble on being a landlord and subletting, and a gamble on the vacancy side of things. So those create real barriers to entry that I think have a sustainability problem, but also a market vibrancy problem because people therefore go, oh, it's too risky, I can't do that, or it just stops them from doing so. So then we get to the question: when you say how could the funding model align, to kind of better, how could it align better to kind of address some of those core issues, in your opinion?
I think I always start with the people, right, that are being
Hmm.
supported. So
Yes.
the system needs to recognize their needs.
Hmm.
And so if it's determined that somebody in the house needs an active overnight staff member, that's a small group of people in the NDIA, to be safe,
Hmm.
right? That is a critical requirement for them, for their well-being. Then to not ensure there's enough funding for that
Mm.
puts the decision point about whether that's rostered or not in the decision of a service provider. Now, at Achieve, I know the decision we make, and we're a large scale provider, we're always going to have the active overnight staff member. But across the market, there are lots of providers that probably are not as established as Achieve, and they're being asked to make tough decisions. They're often these days unregulated. We are a registered provider. And so my worry is that risks are then taken where the active overnight staff member isn't there when that person really needs it. And
Mm.
so for me, I start purely at the person risk, right? That is an unacceptable model.
Hmm.
It shouldn't be in the hands of any organization to make that decision. They should have the right funding to keep the person safe. If they don't then roster that, then that is gross negligence.
Hmm.
If you underfund them
Mm.
and expect them still to do it, then you're putting them in a really difficult situation where they've got to balance their duty of care versus their ability to pay staff and sustainability. And I think that is an unreasonable piece of market design.
Correct.
On more broadly, I'm a strong believer that disability support work done well is complex and requires deep thought, training, focus on outcomes. And so it should not, it should be hard to support people in accommodation. Organizations should have to jump through a lot of hoops to prove their bona fides to be able to do that. Because and I know in our own service, you're not just rostering disability staff. Often you have a lot of responsibilities to support people in a whole bunch of different parts of their life when they live in an accommodation that you live with. And so you want to make sure that the organization is doing that, well resourced, have the right skills, have the right systems, oversight, and training. And I think that's really, really important. That's something that the regulators should expect of the market.
Hmm.
Equally, though, the market should expect, if they've got all of those things,
Mm.
that they are funded to be able to do the service well. And I think that is
Mm.
the play off there.
I think that's spot on. Yes, bringing together those two things, fund it adequately, and the onus to fund it adequately needs to be on the NDIA. and kind of correspondingly demand that active overnight in that example is actually put on. That's really amazing. What about the again, think non-SDA for a second. Think about when you've got the tenancy risk, so to speak. You've got the landlord risk, and to me, it's always been,
So I'm going to come in. I'm going to come in
Yeah.
and say I have a
Please.
fundamental belief
Yes.
that no provider
Yep.
ever should be allowed to be the landlord and the service provider. Because
philosophically, I agree. In principle, I agree. Yes.
my
Yes.
starting point is that situation in the market should never have been allowed to be created, and the sooner government acts to make that not an option that is acceptable, will be better for people with disability, their families, because that very environment puts too much power in the hands of the service provider. People often talk about choice and control in the disability community, and I think too much emphasis is sometimes put on choice and not enough on control. And once you've got the provider who is also the landlord, and then they have, in my view, too much control, whereas the balance of power should sit ideally with the participants as consumers of disability services. So for me, I get that those are complex scenarios, but my starting point is they shouldn't exist in the first place, those models.
Philosophically, I 100% agree. I think that again, I know that Achieve, for example, is you play in the combo space where you've got SDA and SIL funding, so therefore, there's almost,
and we've actively separated. So
which I know you have. You've got different
we
organizations.
separated a long time ago. We did that, more than 5 years ago now.
Yes.
Because we don't just I don't just say that is my view. We've taken action as an organization. I mean, most recently, we for a long time internally held the view that it was a conflict of interest to be someone's support coordinator and to be someone's service provider. And we ran quite a profitable support coordination business, but took the decision last year that if that's our philosophical view, that's what we put in writing, then we should do something about that. And so we've separated out. We've handed over all of our support coordination to other providers and no longer provide that. So we try really hard to live out those philosophical positions as an organization.
Totally agree. And on the COS side of things, we've done the same in the sense that we just don't do support coordination, full stop. But what you're describing there is Independent Housing Australia, IHA, is a separate entity. That's your landlord, right? That's who you go to for the accommodation.
And we have multiple SDA providers. In fact, our largest SDA provider, probably Bridge Housing, but we probably work with about 9 of them these days. So across, across, So yeah.
Well, and that's also key, isn't it? The variety of that. So when one has SDA in the funding, I suppose that there's the I don't want to use the term luxury, but there's it's more possible to have that separation, right? So I think it's when it's non-SDA funded, SIL only, the market is broken. I agree. I also think that the government needs to step in to provide a more consistent model, not only to have an independent landlord, which I think would be a brilliant outcome, not only that, but to have maybe a more standardized way of doing things when it comes to, well, how much percentage can you reasonably take from someone's disability support pension? What is that percentage? Because there's no set standard. It just goes, whew, it's a wild variation. But they're also just addressing, what's the economic viability of that? Because the DSP contribution by itself is not enough to cover, commercial rent, even Commonwealth rental assistance. Well, that's something that the individual has to go to Centrelink to apply for as an individual. Yeah, that's okay, but it doesn't really just solve the problem for the person with disability. Like I don't know, tell me what you think about this. Wouldn't it be great if we could come up with this new thing, whatever it's called, it's SIL rental package or something, and that the Australian government just fixes that bit so that is just an adequate amount of money that goes to the landlord. You know what I mean? Like, rather than saying a bit here, a bit there, and a bit of this, and putting it all together. Yeah.
So I guess, Chris, my answer to that question is I think that already exists. It's called community housing. Right.
Oh, touche, but we've got a problem there.
So the answer is really that community housing needs to be available for people with disability. And I think I do think the NDIA has an obligation to ensure that participants have capacity to access community housing. I think there is a big role for state governments to play in making sure they have adequate community housing for people with disability. But, people with disability are no different to anybody else in the community, right? If you can't afford to access housing, we have a safety net system that exists. And that is the community housing system. And my wish would be that community housing was adequate and able to provide for people with disability. I think there are lots of really vulnerable people in the community. People with disability are one cohort of them, but there are other cohorts too, right?
Yeah.
And so we have to have a system that works for all of those groups when they are, when for whatever reason they are locked out of the housing market and they're vulnerable, and that is the system that should step in and support them, in my view, right? And so I don't, and so I completely accept the commercial rental market doesn't work for people on the disability support pension.
Right.
It doesn't work for people on unemployment benefits either. It's a really difficult space. That's why we need those social net systems to work.
I agree with you philosophically. Once again, the challenge is adequacy, right? So like I had the CEO of Home in Place on the podcast a few months ago. Great conversation. And the genuine question was, what's the waitlist time? Of course, it varies, right? If someone's in an extreme situation, they can be prioritized up, but the wait list for community housing can be a decade, literally, depending on one's circumstance, right? So I think that the adequate stock and prioritization of people with disability, that has to be very seriously addressed if we're going to address the problem we're describing here for SIL providers. Yeah.
I mean, again, my answer is let's address the problem for the people. The people need housing. The providers come second, right? And and I think the same for our own the people we support in our service. So I do think it is a real challenge. I completely acknowledge it as a challenge, but I also know that there are lots of people who are on those wait lists for community housing who have really valid reasons to be provided housing. It's a difficult space when you start to say that one kind of need is greater than another kind of need. I wouldn't want to be the minister that had to try and work that out. So for me, I think the answer is let's maximize available social housing for the people who desperately need it. That would be my starting point. I do think there is an argument that more people should be eligible for SDA. I'm not an expert in that space, but I do think some of the interpretations of people who are not provided specialist funding tend to look primarily at the support needs of the individual. And sometimes they don't take into account the staffing support needs of an individual. So the example might be where you need 2 people to support you for specific activities inside your home, or because you have some complex behaviors, so space is important, or you're really vulnerable and you're high risk. One of the challenges is they don't think about the fact that it will be a home and a workplace. And so is the home appropriate and able to be used as a space that's both a workplace and a home, and that staff are going to be able to move around and do the tasks they need to do. And that isn't always the case in social housing, community housing, the rental market. Particularly in tight spaces like bathrooms and other areas. I do think it is a really valid question about whether some of the interpretations in that space aren't aligned to the actual use and need of the home.
Spot on. And I know from speaking to a lot of SDA developers that the average SDA developer will tend to try and get as many high physical support HPS style apartments, for example. That's what they're aiming at because that's the best return on their investment and all that stuff. Some of them are able to do robust, but some stay away from it. So there's all of that, but they are the other 2 ends of things on the lower category side of things that unfortunately aren't as profitable for the SDA developer when they're building something new. And also the way the model maybe arguably is currently constructed is it's maybe not quite thinking as much about the group setting as much as it could do. I don't know if you have anything to say on that. Like, could you, when you think about a SIL house more broadly, could there be an opportunity to, as you're saying, to kind of try and get your average marketplace 1 to 3, 1 to 4 house? Could it be partly addressed through better accessibility to SDA at the lower ends of the category, so to speak, for less complex needs? Because it's not just on housing then,
I mean, this is not really my area of expertise, but when I do think about it, I think that there is more space for greater innovation
Yes.
And that is certainly not happening in the housing design space. It's not happening, I think, in the housing model space. And I'm happy to talk a bit about that, like in the support model space
Mm,
either. And I think that's a challenge for the sector. I think
mm,
there are some innovative ideas being worked on in that home and living space. And things around share house models and other models, which are really
mm,
interesting to me and I think worth investigating over time. Um, um, so the challenge for me when I look at both the rental market space for SIL
mhm.
only homes and the SDA space is what you can see in the market is heavily clustered development.
Yes.
So there are specific suburbs where the numbers for SDA and probably also the numbers for private rental add up.
Yeah.
And so then you get large numbers of people with disability all living in often outer suburbs of capital cities,
Yep.
oversupply in those markets. So poor returns.
Mm,
But also that takes away choice
mm,
and control from people with disability because suddenly the only options might not be where you choose to live. And I think there's always got to be a dose of reality. Not everyone can live in Vaucluse. But I do think a system which does that probably engineers greater trouble and challenges down the line for sustainability, but also just ideally, people should be able to live right across city locations. They should be
mm,
able to access different services, and often the services that people with disability need to access are
mm,
not in those suburbs that are now seem to be proliferated with large numbers of disability support homes. And so that worries me.
yep.
It worries me for the quality of life of the participants that live there. It worries me because I don't know that the associated services in healthcare and other spaces are adept enough to deal with all of those challenges.
Mm,
So I do think it is a market that needs some rethinking. I
mm,
also think SDA developers and SIL only providers
mhm.
hold some of the responsibility for that.
Yes.
Um, if you make a market investment decision and you make a poor one,
Yes.
then that's on you, right? And you need to, no system gives guaranteed returns.
Yeah.
And if you build a set of group homes in a suburb where people with disability don't want to live or there isn't demand,
Yep.
then that is a poor set of business decisions.
Yep.
I have some sympathy for investors, often people in their pension funds who might have been
Mhm.
promised one thing and get
Mhm.
another outcome. But at its heart, that's a poor investment decision. And it's not the obligation of the NDIA or the Commonwealth government to bail those providers out or fix those challenges. So
Yes.
I do think that there are negative outcomes for participants.
Yep.
That concerns me. I think that providers in the space, whether they have an obligation to think about all those things when they're making business decisions.
Correct. I've had several SDA developers on the podcast, and they're all saying the same thing that the mum and pop self-managed super fund version of SDA developments, that's unfortunately going to see many challenges, poor investment decision outcomes, and that's going to be the bit that struggles. And there's probably going to be a consolidation towards, more organized, more established, perhaps institutional investor side, bigger players basically on the SDA front, just because of maturity of understanding the market. I'm not averse to that because I think it's got to be well implemented. Let's move on to pricing more specifically around differentiation. So, are you in support of differentiated pricing, and what does that actually mean? Because we're all used to the price guide, and using the price guide for a certain number of dollars per hour and a certain rate on a Sunday or a Monday. Tell me about differentiated pricing from your perspective.
So the first thing I think is what I want is a differentiated market, right? I feel it is a terrible experience for consumers currently. If
Okay.
I go to a disability expo, and I see all of the pretty signs, everyone promises the same person-centered support. So my first starting point is, in our own organization, I often kind of uh, I want people to come and talk to us and us to be able to say, this is what we're fantastic at.
Yep.
And this is how we work. And if that's the right choice for you, choose us.
Hmm.
And we will, you know, personalize our supports around what we're great at. Right? But what I see is every provider say that they will be anything for any person.
Hmm.
And when you're anything for any person, my worry is you're not very good at any of those things. How can you be, right? Because you're not specialized. And so the starting point is, I don't know that the market is, as providers, we need to be more bold and be willing to kind of separate ourselves up. So it's just not a different colored car that turns up. It's actually a different kind of supports, and consumers can make choices. In saying that, I also know that even in our own service, some of the supports we provide are significantly more complex than other supports we provide. And we work at the very pointy end of the service. We deal with clients with very complex and violent behaviours. We deal with participants who have extraordinarily complex clinical support needs and everything in between. And for us, I do know that if you're supporting a child at end of life supports who requires complex interventions, that's probably different than just taking someone for an hour of CP. And I don't know that the flight price adequately reflects that.
Okay.
And so I think that's a challenge. But equally, I also feel like the pricing model doesn't reward innovation, and it doesn't reward outcomes. And so I think those are the spaces where there is opportunity to rethink how we fund disability service delivery. It doesn't reward quality. In fact, the current pricing model probably incentivizes providers to cut quality, right? You get, and so that worries me.
Okay. Let's unpack that a bit more, because I get it. So we take the quality question, right? If I put a marketing hat back on for a second, well, where can quality be measured? It's measured in the customer journey, the customer experience. You can check out your reputation and your reviews and all that stuff, and it will, that the market itself, the free market, will differentiate between the cowboys and the good ones, right? So in what ways? I'm just doing a contrast to compare here for a second in my mind. In what ways could price differentiation, be linked to quality? Because of course we have to also do the unit cost thing still. I get it, you're right, because we've still got the SHADS award, we've still got it costs you X per worker per hour, and we've still got split shifts allowances and all the things that are very much X number of hours by price. So just help me understand. I'm interested, to how does quality link to the pricing factor, basically?
Well, for starters, there's no incentive to register your organization in the current model, right?
That's a really good point.
So one group of providers has, like Achieve, we're registered, and we go through all of the costs involved in being registered and delivering under a really detailed compliance model.
Yes.
But the provider next door to us, has can themselves opt out of registration. That's a complex thing to explain to consumers, but they then don't have any of those costs. So the really obvious way that the current pricing model incentivizes a move away from quality is you make more money if you're not registered, right? That's because you have less costs, right? So there's a really easy starting point. And and again, that's a provider challenge. I think of it more like this, right? If it was a food court and you walked in and you knew that two of the providers met Australian food safety standards, and the provider next door had been given the choice, they could just opt out, not meet food safety standards, and still sell food to you. Which one are you going to go buy food for?
It's a shocking analogy, right? Because sure, I'll take the salmonella. It's a really awful market.
And so in the current model, 90% or 80% of providers are not meeting food safety standards. That would be the analogy in the food court, right? But they can charge the same. In fact, they are regulated to get paid the exact same amount of money. So your butter chicken from the provider that meets food safety standards, and your butter chicken from the provider that's opted out themselves. Now, they might still do great work and be very clean in their kitchen. No one is checking on that, though, so we don't know. Can charge the same amount of money for that dish. Now, in that situation, if I was a consumer, I would want to buy from the one that met food safety standards. So that for the analogy for me is where I look and go, the market doesn't incentivize even the most baseline of quality, right? Which is to meet minimum standards. Then I think there are ways beyond that to kind of incentivize and recognize the differences in complexity of services and
Yes.
track outcomes, cost savings to government. I think there are different ways you can do that, but I do think there is real opportunity in that space.
Totally. So we've got things like the high intensity descriptors, the HIDPA. There are some elements of being able to do differentiated pricing, I believe there. Like, is that sufficient, or do you think it needs to go further?
Really good point. We probably in our service have 170 participants who
Yep.
receive more than one HIPTA support,
Mhm.
but don't get HIPTA funding.
Got
Right?
it. So again,
And
it's the
so
disconnect, adequate
we have
funding.
some participants who receive 7 HIPTA supports and don't receive HIPTA funding. And so if that's the differentiation and model you're going to use, and for those listening in, HIPTA is high intensity, personal care and support.
Yep.
So it's things like complex behavior support, might be ventilator support.
Yep.
We've got people who receive subcutaneous injections and still don't get
Yes.
HIPTA funding, right? So
Yes.
if that is the model the agency wants to use, then they need to be really diligent in making sure the people who receive that support get that price.
Correct.
Because as a provider, we're putting all the effort into training our staff to be
Mhm.
able to carry out those support levels. Skill assessing them, doing observations, putting them through extra training. There's a real cost to be able to do that well. And there's regulatory costs and oversight costs to do that well. And I don't know that those who decide package sizes recognize that.
I agree with that. And also I think that if you don't have HIDPA properly aligned to actual support needs, and it has to be done dynamically. If that changes tomorrow for the person, it needs to be in their plan like next week. You can't be waiting 12 months to maybe get it. Because it's crucial, it's critical care sometimes. So I think that yeah, that's crucial, because if you're a support coordinator, and if you're maybe more, because maybe you're facing the challenge of a constrained budget, right? And you go, oh well, I could go to Achieve Australia, and I know they're really good and they're probably the best, but I could go to the crappy guy that's dodgy, and it will meet the budget, and I'll get 52 weeks of care. Unfortunately, you're right. The pricing model is a conflict of interest, because they might go, ah, they might be tempted to go to the less low quality provider, because they're basically saying they're not worried about the quality of the service. So I think, yeah, thank you. That helps make the connections. I think it's the HIDPA thing, I think the registration thing. Those are key things. One of the other ways of addressing registered versus non-registered, of course, is to make mandatory registration for everyone. I feel like I think it's equally crazy that we're living in a developed economy like Australia, and we're in the healthcare sector basically, and we're not requiring mandatory registration. Like, if you compare it to being a nurse and being registered with APRA, for example, like, how are we not doing this already? It feels like the Wild West still, to even allow unregistered providers to exist, and that may be an extreme point of view, but I think when it comes to especially more vulnerable people, there's a case to be made. But because you see what I mean, you can fix it in two ways. You can go, here's the cheaper one that's not registered, here's the more high quality one, that's one way, or you just go blanket, everyone has to be registered.
So I think we know how this story ends.
Sure.
Um, we can look at the childcare sector,
Okay.
right? So human services, aged care, childcare, disability have all kind of moved in similar directions in this space, right? And we know now what the end point will be and is for government, right? Which is to support vulnerable people with government funding
Yep.
will require significant registration, oversight,
Yep.
expectations around quality and outcomes. And so we
Hmm.
know you can trace the explosion of childcare centres that happened, the whole ABC childcare process, and then where we are now with greater oversight and regulation. This is a human services challenge. I think I love the NDIS as
Yep.
a policy thing. I'm super excited about it. I would love the regulators in the agency to view their role as continuing to be leading the way. And one of the things is to look at what's happened in other sectors, learn from it, and actually be the innovators that charts the course which gets the balance right between regulation, quality, oversight, and choice, right? And I think that is a great opportunity. This isn't one of those wicked policy problems that has no right answer. There is a really obvious set of right answers here. You can look at what's happened in other markets. You can look at what's happened internationally. The opportunity for them, though, is to innovate and come up with levels of regulation, levels of oversight that meet and match the person's vulnerability, possibly, or their support needs, and have a really dynamic market, right? I think that is the opportunity that lies ahead.
Mm-hmm.
It's really unfortunate, I think, that the market stewardship of the agency has been, let's let a bazillion providers open up a shingle with almost no oversight or regulation. Let's let the most vulnerable people be moved and shifted around between any of those different providers, particularly at that really complex SIL end. You've had people who should never have been in unregulated providers that, because they have no ability to exercise choice. Often they had no people responsible, and we've seen all those stories explode in the media. That was a bad set of market stewardship.
Yes.
What I would love now, though, and I'm really confident, we have a fantastic minister, and I'm really confident we've got an opportunity to rewrite that story. Instead of having kind of almost no regulation and a cowboy model, actually be leaders in innovation around how you regulate a system to get choice, dynamism, and safeguard people's needs. I think that's a real opportunity, and I'm excited about it.
Correct. I think the when I think back to Bill Shorten's and the review and all that stuff, I think that when it comes to mandatory registration, there probably is a lot of wisdom in think about like a software package, the light version, the regular version, and the premium model, right? So maybe we should lift the standard by having everyone on at least the light version, which again will safeguard the stuff that we're not seeing enough of. Hey, we're checking that you definitely have first aid and CPR and a worker check. Like if we can get everyone on the light version, even just doing that, that's a win for the industry, And then of course you've got the regular and the premium models, etc. Something like that needs to happen. Okay, so again, let's kind of go back down to financial models and just reflect on some of the other things that are happening in the state of the sector. Like Achieve Australia is part of Alliance 20, which is I think the 25 top providers in Australia now. They've kind of gone from 20 to 25. And one of the members of that group was, of course, Bedford Group. And Myron, I've had on the podcast many years ago. I was very sad to see that they've gone into voluntary administration. Are there any kind of lessons that other providers, can learn from the organizations that unfortunately have gone under? What can we all reflect on in terms of the way that we run our businesses or organizations? What do we need to bear in mind going forward, bearing that news of going into administration for Bedford Group?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to comment on Bedford. I don't know the detailed analysis of those. But what I can say more broadly, I'm acutely aware of all of the challenges across the sector.
Yes.
And what it would say is that the current market model isn't working, and that it's too hard to be sustainable under the NDIS. And if I think and talk to my peers and look at the work we do, we put a huge amount of energy and effort, and we're pretty successful in being sustainable. And we've been very sustainable over the last period. And we did a lot of heavy lifting and hard work and made difficult decisions to set our organisation up to do that. And that around, paying under the award rather than EBA, having our staff at the right levels, but also decisions around how we structure our business, being really cautious about growth. All of those things have meant that we're in a good position, but I also will say it's really hard work. And I worry that there are two really negative impacts of that. Good organizations with good learning and good information and good people aren't making it. That's one challenge. The other challenge, though, is that this is a time when I would love to see more energy in innovation.
Yep.
In the sector. And it is really challenging to innovate when you're spending your effort and energy just trying to keep the machine running, right? And so that is a real challenge for everybody. And it achieved the way we've tried to combat that is we've launched a separate foundation which does a lot of kind of research and innovation into practice, into attitudes of the community, running a large project about trying to employ people with disability in the disability support sector, and trying to find space where we carve off resources and dedicate them to innovating. But I know that that's a real challenge. And so the loser in that is that we're not having the dynamism that I think people with disability deserve from the market. And so I do think we need to rethink that. If we want to see greater uses of technology, we want to see greater uses of new models of support, we want to see people really pushing the boundaries around how you can deliver services in different environments to different groups. I think that's all really important, but it's really challenging for every provider to do that if they're just trying to sustain and deliver good quality services within the margins that they currently have.
Yeah, agreed. If you let me ask you a question that goes, I want to know what's the biggest issue on your mind. Like if you could whisper something into the ear of someone from the NDIA and wave your magic wand and change one thing tomorrow in the industry, what would it be?
I have a different view about the NDIA, right?
Okay.
They are the organization, but we elect a government to deliver on policy, right?
Okay, yeah.
And so the challenge here is not for the administrators in the agency.
Okay.
The policy makers are the ministers. I have great faith in the minister, Jenny, and Minister Mark. I've known Jenny for a long time. And so I know that she is deeply across the detail. I know that she is incredibly clever. And I know that she's can be a real fighter. I've seen her in difficult challenges against difficult policy issues in other sectors, really fight for the best overall outcome. And so the challenge here sits with government. And so if I could wave my wand and have one thing happen, I would love to see from the Commonwealth Government a response to the NDIS review.
Yes.
And so, there are things in the review I think are great. There are things in the review that probably don't work for service providers. I believe it is a good compromise to transforming the agency. If I could wave my wand and get one thing, I would want a detailed response to that, and I want a timeline for implementation. I would also want a world where the minister sets the policy and the agency delivers on it. And so for me, that would be a better shift, right? And I think the NDIA, I think they're great people in there, but I think it's a really conflicted job. They're trying to do to reduce costs. They're trying to manage workload. They've got a whole bunch of challenges. And so it's difficult to do the policy determination when you've got all those competing challenges. The government really needs to do that work and then ask the agency to implement. And for me, that I think if I could wave my wand, I would have the government respond to policy and the agency be reimagined as an organization which delivers on the agenda that the ministers set in the most effective way possible. I think that would be a better outcome for people with disability. I think it would give greater clarity to providers about the future forward and deliver the taxpayer value for money out of this system. I think there is great goodwill still that exists towards the NDIS.
Yes.
I think that it is a really innovative scheme. I'm super passionate about it. I was there at the very start of the campaign. I was, working on the campaign before it was even called the NDIS. And I fundamentally believe we have come so far. I know what the system was like before the NDIS. And so this is a world different. There are so many fantastic things that are happening. It's important we get it right. That's how I think we do it.
Love it. There's a very lovely distinction that it's in the realm of policy and politics. And I think that the leadership, the challenge they've got is it's got to be a strategic and detailed response that does match actually what's really going on at the grassroots level for providers and participants. And it also needs to be leadership that fundamentally doesn't kind of fall sway to the clickbait of sometimes the headlines that you see in the media, because there can unfortunately be cynicism, of rorting the system and this and that, and oh, it's shocking that this happened, and those stories are horrible. But I think we need to that for me, the political leadership challenge is to really recarve the conversation so that there's not, for the broader public that aren't involved with the industry, there's not cynicism about what the NDIS is. There's actually a wow, isn't it great that we have this in Australia? Like, I come from the UK, so I grew up in the NHS. I'm proud of the NHS, and I like the fact that it's not bad here in Australia either when it comes to Medicare. But I think the nation can be proud of what we're doing as a scheme, but it is going to require those in political leadership to bridge those two gaps. You got to bring on board the cynical public, and then have a reasonable response to the industry itself.
Yeah, that's right. And some of that's going to require change, right?
Yeah.
And change is hard. And there are individuals who win from the current system, right? So there are some parts of the market, I think, who have probably over profited from aspects of the market. I think there are some participants who are probably overfunded. And that has, I'm sure, delivered them absolutely fantastic outcomes, but probably if you were trying to look for what's the common good and land the mark, needs to be rethought. And there are some outcomes that are being funded that I don't, that I think government could take a stronger view on. One of the things I think about Medicare, because it's a really interesting comparison. You can choose your doctor. You can visit a few doctors and get different advice. Under Medicare, you can choose your chemist, but you can't choose your medication. That gets prescribed and funded, and then you have to go and access it, right? And so I think if you kind of take that analogy to disability, we've got the point at the moment where you can choose your provider, excellent. You can choose who you engage with for services, but there's so much flexibility. You get funding, and then you can also choose whether you use that funding for what it was funded for, or go use it for something completely different, right? And I'm not sure that model is going to be justifiable over the long term to the broader community. So if the community says, your funding was for this level of speech therapy for a 14-year-old who needs the speech therapy because they're struggling at school, and then that money gets spent on something completely different. Well, was that the right set of choices? Or, this money was for community access, but the money isn't being used for community access. You've used it for other things as a decision maker or as a person. Or this money was for equipment, and that equipment isn't purchased and it gets used for other things. Well, I think there's work to be done in how you land a system which gives people choice, and they absolutely should have choice over their package. But I do also think, as a regulator, if you come to the planner and you say, I want my funding to do X, and then you don't use that funding for X, you use it for something else. Well, that's complex as a government, as a government policy model, because all your evidence justified the money for doing, a specific set of behavior support therapy or whatever it might be, physiotherapy, and now it's going to other things. Is that really a good outcome for the system? And so how do you give flexibility, give choice, absolutely, but also have a level of transparency in the system that the funding matches, the activity matches the funding? I think that's a really interesting challenge.
That's fascinating, and the answers, they do exist. They just probably need to be implemented more, arguably, and it could be in the realm of what's a stated support, right? Because again, it can be quite common of core flexible budget, whatever you like, kind of thing. But I think that it's too much of a bind where it's just state supports for the sake of state supports, But where there's, as you said, like where there's a functional demonstration, like I have to have this because this is how I live, this is how I breathe, this is how I, get the care that I need. If the functional evidence demonstrates something that links to a state support, you're right. Probably there should be more stated supports in the plan. And even though funding periods can be a contentious subject, if you combine stated supports with funding periods, then basically the lane that you have to stay in, plus all the lane of finance that you have to stay in, those things can start to manage not just the budget but the actuals that get spent in someone's plan.
Yeah, and I want flexibility. I think again, it's a bit like levels of regulation. People should have I understand and absolutely endorse people wanting choice and control over supports. But in the area that we work, often the decision maker is not the person. We support predominantly people with intellectual disability. And we have amazing decision makers and they make amazing decisions. But sometimes we have decision makers who don't make decisions in the interest of the people that they support. They'll refuse to spend their pension on buying them new clothes. Right? Not everyone always acts in the best interest of their role. And that's a complex process, and you can work through overcoming and challenging that. But the system has to recognize that. And also, disability is complex and can be confusing, and there are a lot of people promising a lot of things. Right? The most common example is the dolphin therapy model, right? Well, there is not much evidence which says that is effective at one end. The other example would be ABA type therapies, where there is detailed evidence that they are not effective and don't work. In fact, they can be harmful, yet people can still opt in to choose those models of support, right? So I think there is a role for when it comes to the market in making sure that the supports being provided are evidence-backed, are proven to deliver on outcomes, and I think that would really assist.
That's brilliant. Well, listen, Daniel, let's wrap it up because I know we're keeping it probably to the hour. So Daniel from Achieve Australia, this has been a wonderful, philosophical, strategic and insightful conversation. Thank you so much for coming on today. And if people want to find out about Achieve Australia, we'll include the link in the show notes, of course. Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for coming on. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you on.
I loved it. Yeah. Thanks, mate. See you later.
Good on you, mate. I'll catch you soon. Have a good day.
Bye.
All the best. Cheers, everyone. Bye.